So we've come to the fifth stage of human development, which is the orange stage in spiral dynamics, and it started about 300 years ago or so. Now what happened in the blue stage was that it really led to stability. It really created structure that allowed human societies to strive, and it brought relative prosperity, general well-being, very good living conditions for most people, trade flourished and so on. But there was one big minus. There was no free will. There was a limitation of the self-determination of people. And people started getting a little bit upset with that. People really wanted to have more joy in this life. Because all these religions are about having a good and pious life here, and then in the afterlife we will have a good time. But actually people said, no, we want to have a good life now. Why should we wait? So in this stage there's many interesting changes. The first one is that it leads to the start of true scientific thinking. What is true is something that can be proven, and not just some kind of dogma. In the blue stage, basically what is written in the Holy Scriptures, or what the clergy tells, this is what is true. And there's no point in arguing with it because this is how it is. But in this orange stage, people start challenging it, and they say, hey, but look, the facts do not correspond to what is being said. So let's dig deeper into it, and let's do some kind of experiments, and let's see where we get to. Now, the scientific thinking really leads to many improvements and allows people to produce things faster, to have better transport systems, and so on and so on. So this is really the start of an industrial revolution. And the industrial revolution in turn brings so many other things. For example, capitalism, the whole consumption society, the philosophies of humanism and liberalism, or the governance models of liberal democracy. They're all born in this era. So it's very important to understand that in this orange stage, people again become more individualistic, more ambitious, they strive for money and success, they become materialistic, and they really want to have fun here and now. So this stage is still very much the basis of the value system for people in the industrialized world. So many people in Europe, North America, the post-Soviet states and so on, they have very much this mindset. What are the consequences on marriage and sex? Nothing fundamental changes in the marital systems. Basically monogamy is the only allowed system. For a very simple reason, it's the most democratic system. Everybody's equal. But somehow some people try to re-establish some sense of ownership. It's not the property rights like you had in the red stage, but it's more about using the partner as a symbol of success, some kind of status symbol. And it's also the unwillingness to give some kind of freedom to the partner. It's a very egocentric approach. Now, what are the impacts on pre- and extramarital sex? Now, premarital sex is not encouraged, but people start challenging it because they want to have a good life. And why would you wait until marriage to have sex? So challenging this view on virginity starts with men, but also later women start challenging this as well. Also in extramarital sex, we see some changes. Cheating still remains something that is not considered to be a good thing, on the contrary. But there's again the challenging of the ideas of consensual non-monogamy. Why wouldn't it be allowed? I want to have fun, so why wouldn't I allow myself to have sex with somebody else than my spouse? So this is basically the stage in which the whole concept of swingers arise. People who agree with their partner to have extramarital sex as long as it is done with the free will of everybody, nobody gets hurt, and it's done in full respect of each other. And also postmarital sex becomes something that is more open. It's not a taboo. There's nothing wrong about somebody who was married before, who had children with somebody else in the past. And actually, if we're looking now in our society, Many people are getting married a second or a third time. If we're looking at many people, many famous people, many have been married for 4 or 5 times. And this becomes some kind of the new norm. It's no longer a taboo. What about prostitution? Well, prostitution starts flourishing again in this stage. Basically because extramarital sex becomes somehow allowed and people want to have fun. So if you cannot just find somebody very easily, you just pay for it. It's a very transactional approach to it. And it's this whole transactional, this consumerist approach to sex, which is also very important here. Now, in some places prostitution was more stigmatized, in others it's more liberal. But something that we see almost everywhere is that it's mainly the prostitutes who are stigmatized, and those people who make use of prostitutes, it's more or less normal. And of course, this prostitution also has a huge impact on the spreading of venereal diseases, for example, syphilis. Let's talk for a couple of minutes about sexual orientation and gender identity. Initially, heterosexuality was the only thing that was acceptable, in still a remnant from the previous stage, but people start challenging it. And it's not that in this orange stage all of this is openly allowed, but there's more of a tolerance to it, and people really start challenging these views. Now, the other thing is relating to the gender identity, because in the past people identified themselves with their nation or with their religion or maybe with their profession, but suddenly due to this individuality there are new markers of identity, and suddenly the sexual orientation and the gender, the way you feel yourself, becomes some kind of important parameter of your identity. And for some reason people start looking at this orientation and this gender identity as a marker of who they are and who they are not. Now, I will not go into much detail about the whole gender identity debate here, but it is very important to really see, is this gender identity something that is truly natural, or is it something that is just a matter of self-expression, or is it something that is related just with the negative consequences of this whole falling back to individuality? Because it's very important to understand that gender identity has nothing to do with sex. It's all about how people perceive themselves. Now, what about sexual education? Sexual education starts becoming available again, because it is considered part of normal life and it should be talked about. But the problem is that there is not much knowledge about it. And with the arrival of the scientific method and the rise of academia, suddenly also the field of sexology starts developing. But this comes pretty late. It only started in the early 20th century, actually. Now, what about sex and spirituality? Well, religions, the belief in God, loses a lot of its importance. Many people start turning their back to it and they start believing more in themselves. People start believing that religions are somehow backward and that they're an opium for the people. And the new religion is some kind of humanism. Now, in this humanism where there's more freedom of the people, sex is still very much a taboo. Basically because people don't really understand what sex is about. However, gradually this has been changing, and it is still changing. So in parts of the world where the main value system is rooted in this stage of development, people are getting more and more open to talking about sex, and they also gain more knowledge to really talk about it. But maybe the most important thing that relates to this whole sexuality and spirituality is the birth of Romanticism. Suddenly people start thinking that monogamy is something very romantic. It's some kind of expression of love. It's some kind of divine thing. Maybe there is no God, but it has some kind of, it comes from a higher realm. Now, there's nothing wrong with being romantic in marriage, but it's very important to understand that the roots of marriage are not that romantic, and that this romanticism is something that was later just projected on monogamy. So let's maybe end with talking a little bit about sexual values and the moral norms around sex and sexuality. Very interesting phenomenon here is that in a consumption society, everything is a consumption good. And also sex and sexual partners become some kind of consumption good. Sexual partners become some kind of commodity. And very often people are just changing one sexual partner just for the other, because they just want to have more and better sex. Another very important change in this stage is the role of women, which starts changing. Now, actually, in this orange stage, you could actually say that we have the strongest paternalist views, and there is the strongest repression of women. So isn't there some kind of contradiction? Well, actually not. I mean, what is the coldest moment of the day? It's the moment the sun starts rising. And we have a similar phenomenon. It's actually the moment that feminine starts emerging that you have the strongest repression of women. Basically what happens is that once women try to get empowered, get their own voice, start caring about their own freedom, start caring about their own body and their own sexuality, they're challenging the men. And this pressure creates some kind of counter pressure. So it's something, it's a basic physical thing, basically. I mean, if you studied physics, you know that the more you push, the more counter pressure you're going to have. And this is actually why in the initial stages of feminism, there was a very fierce anti-women stance by certain men. Now, this feminism, which started in the 18th and 19th century, basically says that there should be equal rights to men and women because there is no psychological difference between them. And indeed, step by step, women have been gaining power. And in many parts of the world, we can say that there is already a certain sense of equality, but there's still quite a long way to go. Another important thing is that this whole sexual consumerism has some very negative impact because there is no real sexual pleasure anymore. It's all about having more and better sex, but it's always trying to kind of chase some kind of peak experiences. People are not happy with normal sex anymore. And it's also here that sex addiction actually comes up. Indeed, there may have been people in the past who also had some kind of compulsive attitudes towards sex, but it's really in this orange stage where sex addiction becomes a very common topic. And the final thing is that also in orange we have really the invention of sex toys and porn, because it all relates to having more and better sex.